All right, welcome to CSIS. I'm Dr. Mark Moore, the head of the Project on Military and Diplomatic History. Thank you all especially for braving today's weather. It's great to see all this interest in World War I. For those who haven't been here before, our project is focused on history that also provides insights into contemporary affairs. We're delighted to co-host today's event with the World War I Centennial Commission and the CSIS Project on Prosperity and Development. And Dan Runde, who runs that project here, thank you to you for your support. When we think about, or when historians think about what are the most important events in world history, World War I usually comes out at number one. But Americans actually tend to be fixated on other wars like the Civil War and World War II, but this one is, in many respects, the most important, and we're here today to try to provide some additional awareness. So 100 years ago to this very day, Woodrow Wilson appeared before a joint session of the Congress here in Washington to deliver his 14 points speech. And Wilson had been a professor at Princeton and then was the president of that institution, and he drew upon his academic colleagues to come up with principles for European peace, which ultimately became the 14 points. It's worth remembering a little bit of historical context. This was, in fact, a rather presumptuous act to be doing this. At the time of the speech, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps were still getting organized, and the U.S. had yet to fight a significant battle in Europe. And it was certainly far from clear as to who was actually going to win. And we were at the same time giving our ideas for peace to countries who had seen a whole generation of people killed. For those who don't remember the 14 points, I will give a very brief overview. The panelists will go into more detail, but a lot of the points concern restoring and reestablishing countries that had been damaged by war. There was talk of giving a right, some sort of right to self-determination to colonial peoples. Senator Warner, if you could grab a seat here, we'll here in a minute. So point 4 talked about the need to reduce armaments. And point 14 talked about an international governing body, which led to the League of Nations. And the 14 points remain a matter of great controversy, and you'll hear about some of that today. For some people, they're naive idealism or even dangerous. To those who are more sympathetic to Wilson, they prophesied, perhaps even laid the groundwork for today's rules-based world order. And the impact has certainly been profound. The 14 points greatly influenced the final year of the war and also very much influenced the peace. Wilson's worldview, at least as interpreted by some of the 14 points, created what has been called Wilsonianism. Before I introduce Senator Warner, I wanted to recognize a few other people who have helped make this event possible. Ambassador Todd Sedgwick, if you could raise your hand. Ambassador Sedgwick serves on the advisory board of the Centennial Commission and came to us at CSIS with the idea that became this great event. Dan Runde of the Project on Prosperity and Development, instrumental again. His staff has also been great in helping the details, including checking people in here, but all the other administrative details, and Chris Metzger in particular. Also, is Terry Hamby here yet? The commissioner of the World War I Commission, I believe is going to come here. He probably got delayed by the weather as many have. Hopefully he will get here when conditions permit. So before we bring up our panel of distinguished historians, who are three of the very top historians of World War I, we're going to hear from another member of the World War I Centennial Commission, the Honorable John Warner, who is also a CSIS counselor. He's a former five-term senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia and Secretary of the Navy. At the age of 17, he volunteered for active military duty, which I didn't realize, serving first as an enlisted sailor in the final years of World War II, and then as lieutenant in the U.S. Marines during the Korean War. In 1969, he received a presidential appointment as Undersecretary of the Navy and later became Secretary of Navy during the period of conflict in Vietnam. Between 1974 and 1976, Senator Warner was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve as Administrator for the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration. In 1979, was elected to the Senate and served 5 consecutive terms, establishing a record of being the second longest serving senator in the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And during all of his 30 years in the Senate, he served on the Armed Services Committee, and in his final years, the committee members elected him to leadership positions, first as ranking Republican, and then for his last 6 years, he was full committee chair. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator John Warner. You can sit if you would prefer.
Thank you very much for that resounding introduction. You're in good luck today. Each of you come through this questionable weather to join us, because I got a terrible cold and I can't talk with everybody for 5 minutes. How about that? The most dangerous thing ever, give a retired senator a microphone with no restrictions on who's going to take it back and away from him. But I'm quite anxious, as you are, to move on to a wonderful panel discussion on a subject that is really becoming quite interesting all across the country. I must confess that my father was a Army captain, United States Army 5th Division in World War I, in the trenches. He was a medical doctor, and he was right out on the front lines doing the triage as they brought the wounded in. He had the difficult task of saying, we can save this one, we can't save that one. And I remember he had his little tin Army hat with a red diamond of the 5th Division on it in our library, and it was, he admonished us, my brother and myself, I only wear that hat. And that, of course, was a challenge to my brother and I to steal it at any time he couldn't wear it. But so I grew up with really a wonderful man who had served and seen that war. And for me now to have the opportunity in my final years of life to share with you and many others an interesting afternoon like this with 5 individuals who've given their careers over for a minute to put together a monologue and share with you their own information on a vital subject. I thought how best to prepare my very few remarks, and I went back and read about 3 books, and one of them was John Eisenhower's book. And that brings me to just a little bit of a personal message that I'd like to give you, and that is that Eisenhower clearly puts in here, this is President Ike Eisenhower's son. I have the privilege to know him. He laid out very carefully and very objectively the case that the failures after the fighting to come together internationally, and at that moment in history, after the enormity of the carnage and suffering all over Europe, to put together something that would help foreclose, thank you so much, foreclose any future similar strifes like this. And he said, unfortunately, it just wasn't done, and I'll come back to address 1 or 2 aspects of that. And as a consequence, a mere 23 years since the armistice, we were right back into World War II. Now, some of the reasons for that were the very serious and failing health of President Wilson. I must say, I am a politician. I've studied politics and been acting in it all my life. And it was fascinating to go back for my first trip to read a lot of the things that Wilson had tried to do. And of course, the subject today is the 14 points, but surrounding the 14 points and was the League of Nations and the fact that we were going to enter a treaty, and we had this opportunity, and we had shown the world that this little, somewhat inconsequential collection of states had suddenly come in to be one of the major powers of the world. And it's absolute clear case that our contributions and sacrifices led to the final victory and the defeat of the German military and their allies. So it was important. But what greeted them as Wilson started around, they called it the League fight. I guess that was a way to demean it. President Wilson toured the country giving speeches pleading for membership in the League of Nations. The quality of thought of these debates was usually far more elevated than any other political debate since the Civil War. For American foreign policy, this conflict elicited breadth and depth of discussion that had not arisen before and that remained unmatched since. So we got off to a good start, and there was a lot of enthusiasm. But then it sort of began to steadily go downhill. President Wilson was an early convert in the concept of collective security, and around it shaped many of his policies before and after the World War I experience. He represented the U.S. at the Peace Conference, where he succeeded in making the idea a reality of getting the League incorporated in the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty was much more than the League of Nations. The articles concerned a whole lot of things, but Congress rejected. And he, no matter how hard he traveled, and it really is extraordinary in my readings, he was determined to get this done. But along the way, I mean, he encountered reluctance within his own party, the Democrats. The Republicans were growing in strength. And I even found this in another book. Nearly every leading Republican cordially, this is an interesting use of words, nearly every leading Republican cordially despised Wilson, while the president regarded most of them with anger and contempt. Nor did good fellowship extend broadly within the restrictive parties themselves. Wilson challenged Americans to build a new world order by joining the League of Nations, by saying at Versailles in 1919, quote, "Shall we or any other free people hesitate to accept this great duty? Dare we reject it and break the heart of the world?" Well, Congress did reject it. But if you go back in and as I've done, and as I'm sure our panelists are going to do it, and I want to carefully not tread in their domain, there are time and time again references to if Wilson had only shown the slightest willingness to compromise, he could have seized it and fashioned a compromise agreement. But he refused. This is perplexing to me. Anyone from Capitol Hill being among the American negotiators in Paris. Well, that was a direct affront to the Congress of the United States. I mean, they should have had seats there, but they didn't. And then he avoided counsel with non-congressional leaders of either party. In other words, he didn't want to even meet the senior politicians of both parties to get their viewpoints. Bitterly fought midterm elections in November 1918 had the United States divided by government by awarding majorities in the houses of Congress to Wilson's Republican opponents. And the tide shifted with that. That circumstance boded ill for the cooperation over peacemaking and League membership, and it went downhill from there. But then we have to reflect on the sadness that he experienced in his own physical situation. He suffered a very major heart attack on his trip. As a consequence of that, he had to abandon his trip across the United States, urging the people to in turn come back and tell your congressional leaders, particularly the Senate, of the need to have this League of Nations and the Treaty of Paris, and to ratify the treaty. But all of it ended up in failure, and I'm sure our speakers are going to address it in some detail. So I want to conclude, though, talking a little bit about what we're doing as an organization. We're holding forums, much like this one, wherever we can, all across the country. We're very active. We've got a remarkable group of volunteer trustees, commissioners. They're very diligent, very attentive. This one right here in the front row, the good ambassador, is one of their leaders. The president, or the chairman as we call him, is just a marvelous, good, rough and tumble Tennessean right out of the heart of the country. And we all have developed a great fondness and love for him. And he's just a grand fellow. Sorry Weathers precluded his being here today. But we're coming along and we're making some good progress. And it is my hope that this will continue to build in its importance. But we're up against one problem that nobody's to blame. Nobody really had the foresight to see it. But the Pershing Park was put together many years ago and selected by the powers to be to locate his statue there. And then along came another succession period of legislation by Congress saying that there'd be no more memorials on the mall. Well, then we were confronted now with no alternative to Pershing Park. We were stopped by law. But in our work as trustees and volunteers on getting Pershing Park ready to receive a national memorial, we're clearly seeing the strong disadvantages. And Eisenhower points it out in his book. And it's as follows. Every single major military memorial that this country takes pride in is on the mall. Every one. You start with the Washington Monument, our War of Independence. If you go to the Civil War, regrettably, at the other end, represented by a magnificent structure to Abraham Lincoln, a very powerful president to this day, idolized by people. They're the two boundaries, and in between you have the World War, we start in succession. The first was the Korean War Memorial was built. Then the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built. And lastly, the World War II Memorial was built. And that's why we feel ever so strongly that our national monument to World War I should likewise be on the mall and equated in significance to the other great memorials. And a group of us, the ambassador and I, and Terry Hanby, the chairman, and the members of the commission are trying to get a modest little passage through Congress of a needed amendment to give the option to do it. And so we haven't given up. We're in there still fighting. But this session today is just another building block towards drawing America's attention to the importance of this. The casualties in World War I were extraordinarily high. Terry Hanby uses the statement that the combined death and wounded in World War I exceeded any of the major battles that we experienced in World War II. So I think we all have a moral obligation to see that this anniversary of 100 to the armistice coming up November the 11th on this year is done with the dignity befitting all of the sacrifices made by that generation 100 years ago. And my father among them, I'm proudly to say. And so I thank each of you for finding the opportunity to come today. I particularly thank our panel, and CSIS has been a second home for me for years. I was just a youngster crawling through the halls of Congress when Admiral Arleigh Burke and Dave Abshire, our distinguished representative here in the front row, knows, began to put together the concept of this marvelous organization. It represents the premier crew among the growing importance of think tanks in the nation's capital. I'm going to say this bluntly. I'm free to say whatever I want to say now. And I've watched in the 30 years I was in Senate the concept of think tanks, and you could almost name on 10 fingers the number in town in those days, grow to where they're in the hundreds today. But they perform a very vital function. They can have forums like this. They have no restrictions whatsoever on what should be said. They're devoid of, most of them, politics. I mean, sure, plenty of politicians like myself would love to come. I've spoken here many times through the years, but it's not looked upon as a political organization. It's largely supported by contributions from within the private sector almost entirely, occasionally a government grant or two. But they've done a magnificent job of really filling somewhat of a gap that has existed here between what Congress is able to do and the executive branch are able to do by working together. There's a void in there. And these think tanks like CSIS can move right in and do a lot of the analytical work and hear and hold the hearings and forums that somehow Congress finds awkward in doing. So my hat's off to CSIS. Thank each of you. And now let us proceed to get to the heart of the matter. And we've said what we have to say. I listened to my introduction. I always think of Teddy Roosevelt. He was about to march up San Juan Hill. And I used to love to ride horses. He pulled his horses up for a rest, and he turned to his aide de camp, and he said, "Aide, whichever one of us gets to the top of the hill first can become president of the United States." Well, this rather diminutive young sergeant sort of looked at him and said, "Well, that's very interesting, but I have to tell you honestly, Mr. President, all I ever want in life is to return home safely and become sheriff of Dinwiddie County." Well, I'm now just sheriff of my own county. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Warner, for those wonderful remarks. I'm going to introduce our panel of speakers in the order that they will be speaking, and with the support of Dan Roney's program, we've been able to bring you really the very top people on this subject, and so we're delighted to be able to bring you a quality presentation. So the first person speaking will be Jennifer Keene. She is the professor and chair of the history department at Chapman University. She's also the current president of the Society of Military History. She's published 3 books on the American involvement in the First World War. The first is Doughboys, the Great War and the Remaking of America. Second, World War I, the American Soldier Experience. And 3, the United States in the First World War. Among the many awards she has received for her scholarship are the Fulbright Senior Scholar Awards to France and Australia and the Mellon Library of Congress Fellowship in International Studies. She's currently working on several projects related to the World War I centennial, including a book on African American soldiers and a new synthesis of the American experience during the war under contract with Oxford University Press. And she's also a member of the Historical Advisory Board of the World War I Centennial Commission that we heard about from the senator. Next will be Michael Nyberg, who's seated next to me. He is the inaugural chair of war studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the United States Army War College. He too is the author of many highly regarded books on the First World War and also on the Second World War. His 2011 book, Dance of the Furies, Europe and the Outbreak of World War I, was named one of the 5 best books on World War I by the Wall Street Journal. In October of 2016, Oxford University Press published his Path to War, a history of American responses to the Great War. And our third speaker will be Erez Manela. He is professor of history at Harvard University, where he teaches international history and the history of the United States in the world. He also serves as director of graduate programs at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and co-chairs Harvard's International and Global History Seminar. His most recent book is Empires at War, 1911 to 23, co-edited with Robert Gerwarth. The book of his that's most relevant to today's discussion is The Wilsonian Moment, Self-Determination and the International Origins of Anti-Colonial Nationalism. Erez has held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Council of Learned Societies, among others, and he was a Burkhardt Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. So, Dr. Keene, if you could start us off.
Great. I'm going to leave this here. Sorry. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I left sunny California for what I expected to be a cataclysmic, ice storm. So I'm really disappointed that it's just a few drops of rain, but maybe it'll get worse later on. Thank you very much to CSIS for organizing this event. It's really a great opportunity to talk about the importance of the First World War. So I wanted to start out today by, in a sense, kind of stating the obvious, which is that it's very easy to mock Woodrow Wilson. And I think the person who did it the best was French Premier Georges Clemenceau, who purportedly offered this disparaging line: "God gave us 10 commandments and we broke them. Wilson gave us his 14 points. Well, we shall see." I don't think he really said it, but it's a very good quote, so I'm going to repeat it anyway. But Clemenceau did say this: "Talking to Woodrow Wilson is like talking to Jesus Christ." Now, many other criticisms have come Wilson's way. He's been called a hypocrite for immediately abandoning his promise in the first of the 14 points, calling for open covenants of peace openly arrived at by agreeing to secret, closed-door negotiations at the Versailles Peace Conference. He's been accused of harboring a Messiah complex after he was greeted in Paris with newspaper headlines labeling him, quote, the savior of humanity. And more recently, historians and activists have rightly focused on Wilson's racism as an essential rather than irrelevant part of his presidency. However, by far, the most condemning insult flung his way is not to call him a racist, but to call him an idealist. The 14 points, which is our subject today, Wilson's blueprint for the post-war world, offers much evidence for putting Wilson in this idealistic camp, dreaming an impossible dream. In this document, Wilson called for freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, a, quote,